The world of the novel Emma, and also the social context and social setting of the novel Emma. The action of Emma occurs within a highly defined geographical area. It occurs within the village of Highbury, which appears in many respects to operate, to function rather like a small town. It certainly is a converging point for a variety of farms and local estates in the area. It's quite busy commercially. We pick up the idea that there are quite a few thriving shops there, and ones that sell sort of interesting and quite high quality articles, as well as shops that serve farmers and farm workers and just the general local community. In some respects we see Highbury and its world projected to us like a type of microcosm of British society at the period, although I would suggest it's a highly controlled and idealistically structured microcosm of British society at the period. The community is tight, interactive, thriving. The way of life, again rather idealistically, is industrious, it's cooperative, and it is good-humoured, without a doubt. There's a lightness, there's a charmingness to the social interactions, for the most part, of the people who live in Highbury. As with any tight, close-knit community, though, there is a certain level of restrictiveness that comes through the fact that everybody knows everybody else and knows everybody else's business. People have to be careful how they behave so that they don't alienate others, and they may wish also to keep certain aspects and elements of their lives private. That's entirely understandable. So it's possible as well for there to be a sense of claustrophobia at times in a society like this. It's some part their economic circumstances, but it's also the fact that Jane Fairfax has aspects of her life which she wishes to keep private, which makes the home of Miss and Mrs. Bates, which Jane Fairfax comes to visit, and in many respects they are, of course, her nearest blood relations, so it is her home as well. I'm sure if she had to return to a home they would always have taken her in. But their world and their life and the fact that people are constantly popping in and out to visit them does feel extremely claustrophobic at points, and Jane really suffers in that situation. This is a society as well which the position of the Bateses in some ways goes to illustrate, that is steeped in tradition. There's an established and a highly established social order and codes of behaviour that go with that social order that are expected to be observed. And it will be difficult for people if they don't observe the established modes and codes that are laid out for them. No matter how contented a small society might be, inevitably there will be frictions and tensions within that group. How those tensions and frictions are dealt with is the test of the society, the test of the group, but it also forms the plot of the novel Emma. This mixture of social interaction and retirement, that especially those characters who live on estates or who live in large houses with private grounds, even if those are not functioning estates with farmland attached to them, as is the case for the Woodlands. The Woodhouse is Emma's family home. They have evidently made their money at some time in the past in the city. They have therefore managed to establish themselves as long-term gentry. However, they do not have a working estate attached to their house and grounds. Nonetheless, Mr. Woodhouse is clearly in a state of some retirement and seclusion. in his house, and Emma takes on an aura as a result of the seclusion of superiority, and she assumes that in a sense she has the right to oversee how others in the outside world who don't live such an ordered and structured life because they haven't got such levels of seclusion, one would presume, that she should sort of oversee how other people behave in their lives, and you know what they do, what's appropriate for them to do, appropriate, or how it's appropriate for them to act. There is a certain level of peer pressure that is exerted amongst the members of the gentry, those with the bigger houses, those with the lands, those with the sort of recent connections with that lifestyle, which would include the Bateses and Jane Fairfax. There's quite a lot of peer pressure that people need to conform to certain styles of conduct. There's pressure as well that there should be cohesiveness and integration amongst them. It's important, probably, in their view, that they present a sort of united front to those people who are of a lower social order. I think as well transparency is demanded of people living in this close community, especially amongst those who are landowners and property owners. And that's where a lot of the tension within the plot occurs, because people are, some of them, in situations which mean that they cannot be transparent. And this means that it's not possible for them to act entirely in accordance with the modes of conduct which are prescribed. It's interesting to consider what the common cause is in this style of behaviour amongst the gentry. Is it is there a need to present a united front against a possible uprising of the populace? Is there fear as the parliamentary reform groups, the Spenceans, for example, the followers of Thomas Spence, are becoming more agitated? Is there a fear that this whole way of life could disappear? Or is it just simply that they've always behaved like this, that there's always been a communion between the people of this level of society, and they simply wish to continue in it? And is this, as well, perhaps Emma is not as popular a novel with the general reader today as, say, Pride and Prejudice. And I think Emma is a novel which more clearly sets out a sort of prescriptive code on social position. So is there something about this cliquism that exists here that we find unattractive today? Or is it something that we still recognise? I think intellectually Emma is a more difficult novel to read than Pride and Prejudice, and that could be one of the reasons why it's less popular. I personally would suggest that in British society, at least, we are still looking for a way in which to successfully and acceptably come to terms with the class system, which is still in existence, and also the way in which people living in our society have different levels of lifestyle, different levels of comfort and discomfort, that there are those who are dispossessed and there are those who are extremely rich. It seems to me we are still working with these systems. We haven't found the perfect solution. And there may have been periods in history where the social class system in Jane Austen's novels was looked at with a high degree of criticism, but there may be room at this time more to look at it with a more open analytical approach, to consider you know, how how we you know, compare with this. To what extent do we have a parity with this social structure? To what extent have we achieved something better? And where do we in fact fall short, as we probably do in some respects? I think in this novel, and it's quite a generalised view, that there is an attempt at creating a panorama of society. Now, it's a relatively limited panorama. It's not quite like Dickens in Bleak House, I don't think. But within a very modest setting, I think that there is an endeavour to create a microcosm of the macrocosm of the greater British society. In this novel, untypically, by comparison with the earlier novels, we see Jane Austen engaging or writing a little bit about people who are engaged in trade. We hear mention of domestic servants, and they are included, although we don't actually meet them, but they are discussed and included in a way as real people, not you know, with relationships and wants and needs, and you know, from family ties. We meet as well people from farming. Methods of farming even are quite extensively discussed, we meet as well people who are extremely poor, indigent in fact, when Emma and Harriet go on a sort of a philanthropic walk near the village of Highbury. In some ways, the attempt to depict a panorama here does put me in mind a little bit of Middlemarch. I think that there are echoes in George Eliot's Middlemarch with Jane Austen's Emma. I think a little bit George Eliot was covetous of intellectual capacity, and she has applied that covetousness to the echoes of Highbury in Middlemarch, where in a sense the macrocosm of that's represented in Middlemarch is so much bigger and better done than it's done in Emma. But then, you know, there's about half a century's difference in novel writing between the two authors. There's a lot of creative input that's gone into the genre since Jane Austen was writing. But it does tend to be a little bit with George Eliot that she wishes to lay claim to the intellectual ground that others have covered, but a little bit to do it bigger and better than they did. So yes, I think it's worth mentioning that there is this echo. Social conformity plays a big role, more of a role in Emma than it does in necessarily in Middlemarch. In this novel, there's, as already discussed, there's the sort of requirement on characters to conform socially to what's expected of them. And to some extent, characters are categorised by their economic and social groups. We see this very much in Harriet, and also in Mr. Martin, ultimately, in the novel. Jane Fairfax manages to escape the categorisation that would be placed on her because of the fact that she has been orphaned at a very young age, and that unfortunately her parents were not able to leave any great financial provision for her, and she's been taken care of by another family, the Campbells. But as I say, she manages to escape that, but really only by the skin of her teeth. And it probably, as well, one might say that Jane Fairfax's ultimate the outcome for her strand of the plot in the novel is probably not very realistic against contemporary norms of the day in real life. We see Highbury as well it's part of this panorama. We see Highbury in connection with other parts of the country. There's the village life with its distinct community and interactions, yet some characters are earning their income in London. They've come from Highbury, but they're now living in London, and they travel backwards and forwards. Frank Churchill travels to London, but he also travels to and from his adoptive parents, the Churchills. Jane Fairfax travels. She's expected to move away again, to perhaps move back to London. She's been travelling with the Campbells and the Dixons as well prior to this. The Dixons, or the Campbells, and their daughter, who's married to Mr. Dixon, are also currently in Ireland. So there's quite a broad geographical compass that the novel covers. There's also the nucleus group whom we meet within the novel, but there's a much wider group of people, suggesting a much wider interaction with broader society, with characters some of whom I've just mentioned, whom we never actually meet in the novel, but who are nevertheless a part of the novel. The Campbells, who brought up Jane Fairfax, Mr. and Mrs. Dixon, the daughter and new husband of the Campbells. There are the Coles, a newly rich family who live in the area and who are gradually trying to establish themselves as part of the gentry group within the area. There are also Mr. and Mrs. Churchill, sort of big, wealthy landowners, who are the adoptive parents of Frank. Again, we never meet them in the novel, but they play, especially Mrs. Churchill, play quite a large role in how the plot is unfolding during the course of the story. There was already in Mansfield Park a distinct attempt on the part of the author to depict once again a type of microcosm, the microcosm of the small stately home and estate of the Bertram family, to Sir Thomas Bertram, a baronet. The local community, but it's very much the local community of the gentry level class and their hangers-on. To some extent, the wider world is suggested. The Crawfords, Henry and Mary, come from the much more fashionable, much more urbane, much more sophisticated and knowing, read immoral world of London, and have travelled or have been in close contact with people who have travelled widely around the world, their uncle being an admiral in the Royal Navy. And so when the Crawfords come to Mansfield Park, there's a sudden influx of a new moral code, a more modern aspect, more travelled and, as I said before, knowing aspect of human, sort of human social conduct appears within this group. Fanny travels to Portsmouth and encounters a different lifestyle there, or re-encounters the lifestyle that she comes from. So there are parities in the way in which this society is constructed in Mansfield Park with the world that Jane Austen creates in Emma. There's no doubt a different motivation, a different concept and idea that Jane Austen is trying to express in both novels. However, I would suggest that the way in which society is constructed in Emma is more consummately successful than it is in Mansfield Park, although I think the message that the author wishes to convey is nonetheless different and would require a different vehicle. As I discussed, the plot, discussed in the first video, the plot in Emma is highly detailed, and the way in which the author uses language is also wonderfully fine, delicate, expressive, just consummately articulate. Fascinating, really fascinating, the brilliancy of the use of language in Emma. As you know, going with that, there appears to be this strong concentration in Emma on details of everyday life. They feature really quite prominently in Emma, more noticeably than in other novels, these small facets of the world in which people live, much more copiously given than in her other works. You know, as I've talked about already, we've got there's the town and the village, the country and the estates, there's London. Then the geography of Highbury itself is meticulously given and laid out, the distances between the big houses, how long it will take to walk between one place and another, but also the actual distances, the layout of the estates, where the hedges are positioned, where hills are positioned, where pools are positioned. They all feature. We have a lot of detail about weather as well. Snow, sunshine, effects of the heat, effects of the cold, how the weather brings out different characteristics in different characters, you know, the moods that come about through the weather. And they're all fused with the situations that arise in the plot. Food is discussed a lot. It's discussed really quite a lot. People's looks are also quite, I think, minutely discussed. Harriet is a very pretty and beautiful girl. Emma is a very pretty and beautiful girl, more beautiful than pretty. Jane Fairfax also has beauty, but all three women have quite a distinct look. So once again, we come back to detail. The detail of how these women look, the detail of the homes in which they live, the detail of the estates on which everyone in the plot, more or less, who counts, live. There's a little bit of detail about shopping as well, the different things that they go to buy. So, yes, there's something slightly different about the style, the way in which Emma is written. What I've said here is context, setting and everyday detail in the plot are constructed in a way which integrally interweaves them into the tenor, ordering and functioning of the society in which they feature. The British way of life and system of ordering society on the basis of class is depicted as integral to the Highbury microcosm of the macrocosm, at some level as integral to civilization. So I think what I'm trying to say is that, you know, everything has its place and everything in its place. That creates an ordered and civilized society. That's quintessentially the British society. Is that the message that, it's not my message, but is that the message, or is that some part of the message that Jane Austen is trying to convey? And at this time of, increased interest in parliamentary reform, increased interest in other words, the universal franchise, discussion of, increased rights for people working on the land, in factories, for women, for children. These ideas were beginning to emerge, and the French Revolution wasn't so far back in the past. Is Jane Austen really trying to highlight the preciousness of British society and what needs to be preserved and what needs to be worked on being preserved. I'm not sure. That she has idealised it does seem to be the case. That she's made it very beautiful in the novel Emma also does seem to be the case. Yes, I think it's worth considering, you know, as I've already hinted at, but in terms of, you know, discussion and thinking about the novel, you know, sort of away from watching the video, I think it may be worthwhile to consider whether, you know, given that modern looser social codes for living, how we regard the preoccupation in Jane Austen's work with the hierarchical structure of the society that she depicts. You know, is it something towards which we feel opprobrium? Or is it in fact one of the major reasons why her work has survived and why it retains its appeal? Because people can relate to it, because, you know, we're still trying to figure out an acceptable form of how to structure society. So again, after that last little bit of the discussion, it's worth coming back to those questions and pondering them, I think. I think it's an important aspect of Jane Austen. Especially, I would suggest, for the British reader. The vehicles of the plot, I talked a little bit in the first video about the vehicles of the plot and suggested that they were in many respects in and of themselves banal, that it's the writing and the imaginative use of these elements of the plot that the author makes that causes Emma to be such a fantastically enjoyable novel. And the vehicles of the plot would include paying visits, parties, balls, card games, dinners, picnics. A number of people in this novel really do not have anything else to do. Hard though that might be to believe, but it does seem to be true. They don't have much else to do except for walking, shopping, letters and news. So really these are the things that make up the story. People getting sick, of course, is another aspect of the story. People getting married is another aspect of the story. People proposing and being refused, people falling in love and being disappointed. These are aspects of the story. Of course, it's a romantic comedy. Of course they would be. Independent means and work. The want of independent inherited wealth is deemed in this society as a defect. For example, the Cole family, who have had to work in order to earn enough money, in order to be able to take up the lifestyle of the gentry, are rather looked down upon, at least by Emma. And they do have to, in a sense, purchase their desired social position by engaging in the correct modes, the correct forms of doing everything, showing that they're absolutely on board with the etiquette as established by the, you know, long-term families in this group. Once they've done that and paid due obeisance to it, due respect, then they may be accepted. Prior to that, they can't be. Being of independent means, i.e. being born to wealth or inheriting wealth or being adopted by wealthy parents. Independent means and work. So being of independent means is so much more highly regarded in this society. So where wealth has been inherited, where someone has been born into wealth or social status, or been adopted by people who have wealth. This is so much more highly regarded in the society of Emma. and probably in Jane Austen's society in general. I doubt very much that we would share these same opinions today. The question of financial dependence and financial independence of young people and women, or men and women, you know, pans out differently in different cases, however. So now, for example, it's acceptable for a young man, i.e. Frank Churchill in this novel, to allow himself to be dictated to by his adoptive mother, to allow his life to be constantly interrupted so that it's very difficult for him to, even if he were of that temperament, to establish steadfast, long-term, persevering endeavour at any one activity or project or school of learning. It's acceptable for him to allow himself to be dictated to in this way in order to preserve his inheritance. In fact, the paramount important thing for Frank Churchill to do in his life is not to establish a career or to establish himself as an independent person, to, be his own man in his own world, but to preserve his inheritance. He can't do anything that would jeopardise his inheritance. That's the worst thing he could possibly do. I don't think that this is a moral position that would be so readily shared in today's world. It might be something that people would opt to do, but the extent to which it's approved of might be rather different. Now, at another level though, so Frank Churchill doesn't have any actual individual, independent finance, but because he's going to inherit it in the future, his social status is preserved even though he's not behaving as an independent individual. Now, for Mrs. Bates and Miss Bates, they haven't got any prospects of inheriting wealth in the future. One is the widow of the local Anglican church minister, which would have been a highly respected position in society at the period, and the other is his unmarried daughter. They have a small stipend or pension that has been left to them from out of their husband's estate, and they have to manage very, very frugally. They are sort of magnets for charity, because the social system in which they find themselves disempowers them as single women without private means from going out to work unless they wish to lose their social status. They would gain financially, but financial status and social status were not necessarily paired at this period, and especially for a woman to go out to work was regarded as socially more inferior than otherwise. So in their case, deprivation is preferable to establishing an independent lifestyle. Without a shadow of a doubt, although they continue to be patronised by the local gentry and established landowners, they are in a socially inferior position, more so than Frank Churchill. Of course, he has prospects, as long as he doesn't offend his adoptive parents, especially adoptive mother, whereas the Bateses have not. But quintessentially, as individuals, should one set of people have more status than the other? Obviously at the period there's a difference because the Bateses are women and Frank Churchill is male. That will have automatically created a difference in social status between them, no matter what. Women's lives and their status are strongly contrasted one with another by comparison with the wealth available to them through passive sources which are passive with regard to their endeavours. So Emma, for example, holds higher status than Jane Fairfax because ultimately the wealth available to Emma, not through her own endeavour but through inheritance and from her father in present circumstances, is much greater than the wealth available to Jane Fairfax. But inherently, that doesn't actually make any statement about the individual worth of either woman. Nonetheless, their status is defined by these methods, by these standards. In both of their cases, Jane Fairfax is facing the prospect of having to go out to work. She's going to have to go out to work as a governess, which tended to be a situation, a position in which women were mistreated and which they were made to feel socially inferior, and which by outside social observers would have placed them as a socially inferior position because they didn't have any money. And this is the paradox of the system as well, that where people didn't have any money, then they would be sort of sidelined socially, in part for that reason. But where people did have money, it mattered how they'd actually gained it. It was a very conflicted system. Although probably today we live in a conflicted system as well. Women's position in terms of earning money was, as I say, difficult. There were very few possibilities. They might become a writer, for which obviously the opportunities would have been relatively slim. They might perhaps have moved into singing or playing a musical instrument, concert performance. Again, they'd have needed a chaperone, or their reputation would have been shot to pieces. Acting wasn't really viable in those terms because it was always detrimental to a woman's reputation and would have moved her completely out of the social class of the gentry. Or being a governess, which, as I've already outlined, was a position in which women's status was eroded. Agnes Grey by Anne Elliot provides a very good fictional account of the life of a governess in quite realistic terms. And so there were these restrictions really on all of the women. They had to remain, in many respects, quite passive, except within the domestic arena. And a lot of the confinement of the action of the plot in Emma can be seen as mirroring the restriction in women's lives. It is a very domestically set novel. We see the world and the areas and arenas in which a woman can express her individuality, but by implication, we understand the areas in which she cannot. Women's preserve is really domestic. And that sort of more or less rounds up this section on the setting of the novel and the society and the social codes that govern the society. I hope it's been interesting, not too repetitive.